Tonight, I'm talking about the blood on the snow, about the children's screams echoing in the mountains of Margarita, about the horror that has turned an entire province of France into hunting grounds where people have become game. Between 1764 and 1767 in the isolated region of Zhevodan, something that defied classification killed with an intelligence that indicated consciousness, chose victims with preferences that implied personality, and endured concentrated extermination attempts with a tenacity that mocked human domination of nature. The monster of Zhevodan, as history has remembered this entity, is much more than provincial folklore or a misidentified animal. It embodies the return of primal fear, which civilization promises to banish, but only temporarily holds back. These events, preserved in more than 200 official documents, church records, and personal correspondence that survived the devastating frenzy of the revolution, force us to face questions about the boundaries between man and animal, civilization and savagery, reason and horror, to which, according to Enlightenment thinking, definitive answers have been given. They show how quickly the husk of human control dissolves in the face of predation that refuses to follow expected patterns. How readily the social order turns into mob hysteria, being threatened by forces operating outside understandable categories. Have you ever wondered why certain historical monsters transcend their time frames to become eternal symbols of deep-seated fears? The venerable beast continues to exist not just as a historical curiosity, but as an archetype that each generation reinterprets to reflect their own anxieties about nature, identity, and the fragility of human domination. This is not a simple case of wolves attacking peasants, but a philosophical crisis that forced Enlightenment France to face the possibility that reason might not be enough to defend itself against the forces that preceded and will outlast human civilization. Tonight, we explore the 5 dimensions of Zhevodan's horror, which reveal why this particular manifestation of the monstrous continues to haunt our collective imagination with an urgency that is not diminishing, but growing. From the apparent consciousness of the beast and the tactical intelligence that suggested the mind behind the killings, to the social disintegration that terror created in communities that turned against themselves. From the failure of scientific classification to fit anomalous phenomena into rational categories, to the political consequences of a monarchy unable to protect its subjects from the judgment of nature. These aspects illuminate how the beast served as a dark mirror reflecting the Enlightenment's hidden anxieties about progress, reason, and human supremacy. But this is more than a historical investigation or cryptozoological speculation. The Zhevodan beast anticipated modern dilemmas about humanity's attitude to nature, which climate change and mass extinction make urgent. When we study the patterns of predation of the beast, we see an anticipation of the modern debate about whether nature has forms of consciousness that operate according to a logic that we refuse to accept. When we consider the social hysteria that turns neighbors into suspects, we face questions about how communities respond to existential threats that the current pandemic experience makes viscerally familiar. When we analyze the failure of science at that time to classify the beast, we are faced with the limitations of human knowledge systems in the face of phenomena that reject our categories. When we trace the political consequences of the impotence of the monarchy, we see how legitimacy depends on controlling forces that can be fundamentally uncontrollable. When we study religious interpretations of the beast as divine punishment, we encounter problems of theodicy that persist in every attempt to find meaning in suffering. Welcome to the exploration of philosophical dimensions of monstrosity, where historical horror meets modern anxiety in uncomfortable recognition, where enlightened confidence dissolves into a primal uncertainty that reason cannot completely dispel. I am Mr. Ravenhurst, your guide through the blood-soaked fields of Zhevodan, where something that should not exist by Enlightenment standards has been killing with impunity for 3 years, leaving behind questions about nature, consciousness, and human vulnerability that are becoming more and more relevant, not less, as our own beliefs face unprecedented challenges. The journey we will embark on tonight requires intellectual courage to confront not just a historical monster, but what its existence implies about the categories we depend on for psychological security. These events force us to question assumptions about human separation from nature, about the power of reason to comprehend reality, about the ability of civilization to protect us from forces acting in accordance with values other than our own. They remind us that every enlightenment contains its own darkness, that every claim to conquer nature through understanding invites nature to demonstrate dimensions that we have not even begun to comprehend, that every claim of human superiority risks attracting the attention of forces that can challenge that claim in ways that we are ill-equipped to survive. Part 1. The mind behind the fangs. Consciousness is in the hunt. The most disturbing aspect of the Zhevodan beast's 3-year reign of terror was not the count of its victims, although more than 100 dead and countless maimed represent a tragedy of considerable magnitude, but the intelligence it displayed in its predatory patterns, suggesting the presence of consciousness acting behind the animal's eyes. This was not a senseless killing driven by hunger or territorial instinct, but a selective selection showing preferences, tactics, and adaptability that forced witnesses to face the possibility that nature might possess forms of awareness that human categories of animal behavior could not accommodate. Historical records analyzed by scholars such as Jean-Michel Smith in his seminal work, The Monsters of Zhevodan, reveal patterns of attacks that prioritized certain victims, young women and children over adult men, single people over groups, certain families over others, which suggested more than just opportunistic predation, but a conscious choice based on criteria that remain unclear. These patterns arise from a thorough analysis of primary sources, including detailed reports preserved in regional archives and military correspondence that documented each attack with bureaucratic precision. The beast demonstrated tactical evolution, which involved learning from experience in ways that surpassed the normal behavior of the animal. The initial attacks showed a direct approach, but as the human defense adapted, the beast's methods also changed. He began to take advantage of the terrain, attacking from positions that prevented escape, showing knowledge of human lines of sight and dead zones, which suggested that he studied his prey with the premeditation usually associated with human hunters. Reports described how the beast spent hours watching potential victims before attacking, as if assessing the optimal moments for an attack, gathering information about routines and vulnerabilities. Modern accounts, particularly preserved in the detailed reports of Captain Duhamel of the Prince of Clermont Dragoons, whose military reports remain in the National Archives, describe encounters suggesting that the beast understood human psychology with alarming sophistication. He injured but did not kill certain victims, apparently realizing that injured people would force rescuers into vulnerable positions. He demonstrated an awareness of the limitations of human weapons, maintaining distances that rendered musket fire ineffective while being close enough to inspire terror. Most worryingly, he seemed to recognize specific people in multiple meetings, revealing what witnesses interpreted as a personal vendetta against certain families. The animal's handling of the bodies revealed behaviors beyond simple feeding. Many victims showed wounds incompatible with normal predation, the careful removal of certain organs, the positioning of corpses in ways that seemed deliberate rather than accidental, the markings that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. Some bodies were found partially eaten, but with the best parts intact, as if the beast had killed for reasons beyond hunger. Others were found in places that required considerable effort to transport them, suggesting that the beast wanted the bodies to be found in certain places for reasons that remain unfathomable. The doctors of the time who examined the victims left detailed anatomical records preserved in the departmental archives. These documents, written with a medical precision unusual for that era, describe wounds that showed methodology rather than instinct, precision rather than savage tearing, selection rather than indifferent destruction. Anatomical drawings reveal patterns of attacks targeting specific vulnerabilities with precision that suggested either remarkable knowledge or terrible experience. One doctor noted that the beast seemed to understand human anatomy better than many surgeons, knowing exactly where to strike for maximum damage with minimal effort. The social response to the beast's intelligence turned out to be as revealing as the intelligence itself. The local population has developed complex theological explanations for why God would allow such conscious evil to exist in animal form. Some saw the beast as divine punishment for collective sins. But it raised troubling questions about why the punishment took the form of an intelligent predator rather than a natural disaster. Others interpreted him as a demon in the form of an animal, but this required an explanation of why prayers and exorcisms proved ineffective. Bishop Mann's pastoral letters, preserved in the diocese's archives, reveal a church struggling to maintain theological coherence in the face of an entity that seemed to possess consciousness without a soul. The military responses, led by Captain Duhamel and later King Francois Antoine's personal arquebusier, showed a growing recognition that they were facing an opponent requiring tactics normally reserved for human enemies. Duhamel's reports to Versailles describe increasingly complex operations involving coordinated sweeps, intelligence gathering from attack patterns, and psychological warfare designed to demoralize an enemy he wasn't sure could be demoralized. The disappointment in these documents is palpable. Trained military minds are faced with an opponent who seemed to understand their strategies and adapted accordingly. Modern Enlightenment scholars note how the beast represented an epistemological crisis for thinkers of that period. If animals can have consciousness comparable to humans, what justified human domination? If nature could produce minds that acted according to values other than human morality, what did that say about the purpose of creation? The beast forced them to face the possibilities that threatened the entire worldview, built on clear hierarchies between man and animal, rational and instinctive. The apparent cruelty of the beast, which went beyond the needs of survival, manifested itself most alarmingly. Many reports described how the beast played with victims before killing them, demonstrating behavior that suggested it was getting satisfaction from the terror it caused. Marie-Jeanne Vallée, who famously wounded the beast and survived, described in her surviving testimony how it circled around her repeatedly, making feints that seemed designed to scare rather than immediately attack, as if savoring her fear. This assumption of sadism in animal form violated all convenient assumptions about the immorality of nature. Even more disturbing were the stories of the beast's vocalizations. While wolves howl and growl, witnesses described sounds from the beast that seemed almost linguistic in their complexity. Modulated sequences that varied depending on the situation, different screams for different contexts, vocalizations that some swore contained almost recognizable words. A lot of evidence collected by historians in the 19th century records witnesses who claimed that the beast spoke, although no one could agree with what he said, suggesting sounds on the border of language that human ears could not quite make out. The question of whether the beast hunted alone or as part of a coordinated pack added another layer of disturbing possibility. Several reports describe several animals acting with coordination that suggested a shared intelligence or hierarchical command structure more complex than normal pack behavior. Attacks sometimes occurred simultaneously in places too remote for a single being, but showed similar methodologies that involved either communication between entities or a shared consciousness directing multiple bodies. This raised the possibility of distributed intelligence, which made the beast not an individual, but a network. Historical records of wolf attacks in France, extensively documented by modern researchers, show that Zhevodan's behavior consistently surpassed anything that had been recorded before. Either we are dealing with an abnormal individual of extraordinary intelligence, a previously unknown species with cognitive abilities that we do not associate with non-human animals, or something that challenges our fundamental understanding of how consciousness manifests in the natural world. The legacy of the apparent consciousness of the beast extends beyond historical curiosity to modern questions about animal cognition and the agency of nature. Recent research revealing complex intelligence in species from carnivores to cephalopods. The discovery of plant communication networks suggesting forms of awareness, and the growing recognition that consciousness may be a more widespread phenomenon than human exclusivism suggested, all echo the anxieties that Zhevodan first crystallized. If nature possesses minds acting according to values other than human morality, which can view us the way we view prey, which could adapt to our defenses with a conscious strategy, then our position at the top of the hierarchy of creation becomes an unreliable assumption rather than a divine guarantee. As climate change and ecosystem collapse force us to recognize that nature operates with patterns suggesting intentionality, if not consciousness, Zhevodan's intelligent predation serves as a historical precedent for nature responding to human presence with adaptations that seem deliberately designed to exploit our vulnerabilities. Every extreme weather event that targets human infrastructure with uncanny precision, every emerging disease that bypasses our defenses, every cascading extinction that follows patterns suggesting a systemic response rather than random collapse, all echo the beast's demonstration that nature can possess forms of consciousness that observe, evaluate, and respond to human activity with intelligence that we are only beginning to recognize. Part 2. Social Contagion. How Horror Transforms a Community. Zhevodan's most insidious impact was not in his outright predation, but in the way horror transformed the social fabric of affected communities, revealing how quickly civilizational bonds dissolve in the face of a threat operating outside of understood parameters. The 3-year crisis created the laboratory conditions for observing social disintegration. Paranoia spread through previously tight-knit communities, and the emergence of scapegoating mechanisms that turned neighbors against each other with violence that sometimes surpassed the beast's own brutality. This social infection proved to be more durable than physical attacks, leaving scars on the regional culture that persisted for generations after the last confirmed murder. Historical analysis of collective trauma in early modern Europe provides a framework for understanding how Zhevodan provides one of the clearest examples in history of how an external threat is internalized as a social pathology. The beast was killing bodies, but fear was killing community trust, transforming societies that had functioned for centuries into suspicious aggregations of potential victims and suspected accomplices. Parish records and administrative documents from that period reveal the depth of this transformation. The disintegration began with the erosion of the normal social activities that bound communities together. The markets were empty because people were afraid to travel between villages. Religious festivals requiring gatherings were canceled or held with armed guards, which turned the celebration into a military exercise. Agricultural work, carried out in isolated fields by necessity, became Russian roulette, where peasants weighed hunger against predation. Children stopped playing outside, creating a generation that grew up understanding the outside world as fundamentally hostile. The physical landscape itself transformed in perception from a familiar homeland to a foreign hunting territory where every grove could hide death. The mating patterns in the region showed dramatic disruption during the years of the beast. Young women, being preferred targets, found themselves under virtual house arrest, unable to participate in courtship rituals requiring mobility and social gatherings. Parish records reveal a sharp decline in marriages during 1764-1767, followed by an unusual spike afterwards when postponed unions finally took place. But these post-beast marriages often crossed traditional boundaries, suggesting that the social structures that organized the choice of a partner were permanently disrupted. The economic impact has created cascading social failures. The trade routes connecting Zhevodan to the wider French economy became death traps, isolating communities from markets and creating artificial scarcity. Prices for basic goods soared as merchants demanded risk payments for entering the region. Local production collapsed as farmers abandoned remote fields for the safety of village centers. Tax collection, which requires officials to travel between settlements, has all but stopped, creating a fiscal crisis that prevented an organized response to the threat. The poor, unable to afford the security measures available to the rich, were faced with a choice between starvation indoors or predation outdoors. Class tensions, which normally remained manageable, exploded into open conflict. The peasants accused the nobility of indifference to their plight, noting how the seigneurial hunting rights had been jealously defended before the beast, but now they seemed to mock the dying commoners. The nobles blamed peasant superstition and cowardice for the difficulty of a rational response. The clergy found themselves trapped between the obligation to provide spiritual comfort and the inability to explain why God allowed such a sustained attack on believers. These tensions created a three-way social fragmentation that prevented a coordinated response, while multiplying the possibilities for internal conflict. The emergence of conspiracy theories related to the beast has exposed deeper social rifts. Some claimed that the beast was trained by the nobles to terrorize the peasantry into submission. Others insisted it was divine punishment for regional heresy, pointing fingers at neighbors suspected of lacking orthodoxy. Accusations were flying that certain families had made pacts with the beast, exchanging immunity for information about vulnerable targets. The fact that some households seemed mysteriously spared, while others suffered multiple attacks, fueled suspicions that turned grief into rage directed at the survivors. Jean Chastel, the man who eventually killed what was accepted as a beast, exemplifies the social ambiguity created by horror. Local tradition portrayed him as a hero, but modern documents suggest a more complex figure, sometimes suspected of complicity with the beast, accused of profiting from terror through various schemes, finally achieving redemption through a murder that could have been staged rather than heroic. His life after the beast, marked by neither reward nor punishment, but persistent suspicion, shows how social trust, once broken, resists restoration even after the threat is removed. The role of strangers and outsiders during a crisis deserves special attention. The traditional hospitality culture of Zhevodan, necessary for a region dependent on trade and pilgrimage routes, transformed into xenophobia, which viewed every stranger as a potential ally of the beast. Traveling merchants ended up in prison on suspicion. The pilgrims were denied access to the shrines they had been traveling to for weeks. The military units sent to help faced hostility from the population, who saw them as either ineffective parasites or active conspirators. This collapse of hospitality traditions created feedback loops where isolation increased vulnerability, which deepened suspicion, which increased isolation. Genealogical studies tracing family histories through the beast years document how certain surnames have become permanently associated with accusations of the beast era. Families accused of collaboration turned out to be socially outcasts for generations. Their descendants faced marriage restrictions and economic exclusion based on suspicions of terror-driven paranoia. Other families used statements about killing the beast for social advancement, which established dynasties lasting into the modern period. The horror thus created hereditary social divisions that outlived the memory of specific events. Women faced particular challenges as both preferred victims and suspected accomplices. The beast's apparent preference for female goals created protective constraints that amounted to social confinement. But this defense came with suspicion. Why did some women survive the collisions while others died? Survival itself became suspicious, with whispers that the women who escaped had to offer something to the beast in exchange. Marie-Jeanne Vallée, the young woman who wounded the beast, faced years of suspicion about how she managed what trained soldiers could not achieve. Women's agency, in the context of general impotence, generated fears that sometimes exceeded the fear of the beast itself. The corruption of information networks has proved particularly damaging to social cohesion. In societies dependent on oral communication and information exchange based on trust, the beast crisis created conditions where hearing traveled faster than fact, where exaggeration served social functions more effectively than accuracy, where a statement of inner knowledge became a currency that bought temporary status at the price of long-term credibility. Each retelling added details. Each transmission increased the horror until the information environment became so polluted that a coordinated response became impossible. Religious responses have exposed and exacerbated social divisions. While the official church position emphasized acceptance of the divine will, the popular religion demanded more active interventions. Competing pilgrimage sites claimed that their particular saints offered the best protection. The sellers of amulets proliferated, creating an economy of fear that enriched those who were willing to exploit terror. Accusations of witchcraft resurged as communities searched for human agents to blame for the inhuman threat. Bishop Manda's attempts to maintain an orthodox interpretation were met with resistance from the population, who needed enemies to fight, not secrets that could only be tolerated. The consequences of the death of the beast, or deaths since multiple creatures were killed and declared a beast, could not restore social harmony. Communities that turned against each other during the crisis found that suspicions, once aroused, could not be easily dismissed. Economic relations, disrupted by the horror, proved difficult to repair as trust evaporated. Marital alliances, broken by the accusations, resisted repair. The social scar tissue formed during the 3 years of terror created rigid boundaries where fluid relationships existed, defensive postures where openness prevailed, and suspicious scrutiny where casual interaction flourished. In this way, Zhevodan achieved through terror what no human enemy could achieve through force: a fundamental reorganization of regional society along the lines of fear rather than attachment, suspicion rather than trust, division rather than unity. That this transformation has outlived the beast itself for generations suggests that social contagion may be the most lasting impact of predation, that communities' responses to threats may be more damaging than the threats themselves, that the real monster may be what fear causes neighbors to do to each other in the face of forces they cannot neither understand nor control. Part 3. Classification failure, when science meets the abnormal. The Enlightenment's confidence in the ability of reason to classify and thus control the natural world faced a devastating challenge in the beast of Zhevodan, whose physical form and behavior resisted every attempt at taxonomic categorization. This was not just a case of a misidentified known animal, but an entity that seemed to exist in the spaces between established categories, forcing one to face the possibility that nature could produce forms that human knowledge systems could not accommodate. The failure of science at that time to definitively classify the beast exposed the limitations of rational methodology in the face of truly anomalous phenomena, exposing concerns about the sufficiency of knowledge that Enlightenment thinking preferred to suppress. An analysis of the reports of naturalists of that period reveals how the beast represented an epistemological crisis for Enlightenment taxonomy. Every attempt to fit him into existing categories, wolf, hyena, lion, hybrid, required ignoring evidence that contradicted the classification. The proliferation of competing theories revealed not a wealth of possibilities, but a poverty of frameworks incapable of accommodating the observed phenomena. Natural history museums across Europe preserve correspondence between scientists struggling to make sense of reports that violated everything they thought they knew about European fauna. Modern descriptions of the beast, compiled from more than 100 eyewitness accounts with remarkable consistency, despite coming from a largely illiterate population, represent a creature that violated known anatomical capabilities. Witnesses described an animal larger than any European wolf, with proportions that did not match any known species. The legs were too long for his body, the head was too big for his neck, and the tail seemed to serve functional purposes that no European animal had ever used. Its coloration countered the simple description, with witnesses reporting fur that seemed to change hue depending on lighting or viewing angle, suggesting either adaptive camouflage unknown in European fauna or optical properties that science at the time could not explain. A detailed anatomical report prepared by the royal surgeon examining the creature killed by François Antoine in September 1765, which the crown immediately declared a beast despite the ongoing attacks, reveals the scientific establishment's struggle to maintain classification authority. The document, preserved in the National Archives, shows extensive corrections, crossed-out passages, and marginal notes suggesting fierce debate about how to describe what they saw. Measurements are given, then questioned. Anatomical features are noted, then rationalized. The conclusions are stated, then undermined by qualifying statements that reveal deep uncertainty. The historical study of animal symbolism in European culture highlights how the beast's resistance to classification threatened more than scientific pride. If nature could produce entities that did not fit human categories, what did that say about the comprehensibility of creation? The stakes were theological as well as scientific. Randomness in nature implied either a divine whim or human ignorance, neither of which was convenient for Enlightenment thought. Even more disturbing than the physical anomalies were the behavioral characteristics, which suggested that the animal was acting according to principles unknown to zoology at the time. His hunting patterns showed preferences that made no sense for survival, passing by easy prey to attack difficult targets, killing without feeding, choosing victims according to criteria that seemed social rather than nutritional. Natural historians, who prided themselves on reducing animal behavior to mechanistic responses, encountered a creature whose actions suggested decision-making processes that they could not model without acknowledging the consciousness they were ideologically obligated to deny. The proliferation of hybrid theories reveals a science struggling with phenomena that exceeded the explanation of a single species. The proposals range from wolf and dog crosses to lion and hyena hybrids, each trying to account for anomalous features by combining well-known animals. But these theories created more problems than they solved. How will the African fauna reach Zhevodan? What kind of hybridization could produce fertile offspring with such divergent characteristics? The multiplication of increasingly exotic explanations showed that the classification system was breaking down rather than successfully incorporating new data. The international response to the classification crisis has proved particularly revealing. The Royal Society of London, the mainstay of Enlightenment science, has shown a remarkable reluctance to engage in French reports on the beast. Their philosophical writings during the period contain no mention of events that consumed French intellectual energy. This silence speaks louder than engagement. British scientists seem to have chosen to ignore phenomena that could challenge classification systems rather than risk encountering evidence of their limitations. The role of physical evidence, or its suspicious absence in the classification debate, deserves examination. Despite the numerous murders attributed to the beast, remarkably little physical material has survived for scientific examination. The bodies of suspected animals disappeared, were hastily buried, or preserved in ways that prevented detailed examination. The skulls that could have resolved the debate are gone. Skins that could have been examined determined with suspicious rapidity. This lack of evidence became proof in itself, either of a conspiracy to conceal the true nature of the beast or of characteristics that resisted being preserved through normal means. Attempts at the time to use emerging probability theory to analyze the patterns of the beast proved equally frustrating. Mathematicians tried to model attack distributions to predict future strikes, but the beast seemed to violate statistical expectations with alarming consistency. The attacks clustered, then dispersed without a visible pattern. Preferred hunting grounds shifted without an ecological explanation. The choice of victims showed preferences that probability could not capture. The failure of mathematical tools designed to find order in apparent chaos suggested either hidden variables operating beyond perception or genuine randomness that challenged the deterministic worldview. The medical examination of the victims provided another area where classification failed. The wounds showed characteristics that did not match any known predator. Crushing force that exceeded the jaw strength of any European animal. Claw marks with intervals that did not fit any recorded species. Tissue damage suggesting enzymatic properties unknown in mammalian saliva. The medical documentation of that time, rather than clarifying the nature of the beast, multiplied the mysteries. Attempts to compare injuries with known animals required increasingly sophisticated explanations that satisfied no one. The legacy of the classification failure extends beyond historical curiosity to contemporary relevance. Modern cryptozoology, the search for unknown animals, recent discoveries of species that should not exist according to our models, and the growing recognition that nature's creativity exceeds human imagination. All echo the lessons from Zhevodan. Every time scientists discover organisms in environments deemed incapable of supporting life, every time a new species appears with characteristics that challenge taxonomic categories, every time a hybrid force produces offspring that violate reproductive boundaries, we hear echoes of the beast's laughter at human claims to comprehensive understanding. Climate change is now producing ecological anomalies that resist classification with a regularity that resembles the Zhevodan crisis. Hybrid zones where species merge in unprecedented ways. Behavioral adaptations that disrupt everything we thought we knew about animal cognition. The appearance of characteristics that seem impossible, given the known genetic limitations. Everything suggests that nature's ability to innovate exceeds our frameworks for comprehension. Zhevodan stands as a historical precedent for the modern recognition that confident classification can be a comforting illusion rather than an accurate representation of an infinitely creative reality. Part 4. Impotence of the Crown, when the government gives in to nature. Louis XIV's response to the Zhevodan crisis revealed the fundamental impotence of even an absolute monarchy in the face of a threat operating outside the parameters of conventional governance. The descendant of the Sun King ruling from Versailles with theoretical power stretching to every corner of France, found his authority ridiculed by an entity that recognized no sovereignty other than its own hunger. This clash between political force and natural force exposed the contradictions at the heart of enlightened absolutism, revealing that claims to divine right meant nothing to a being who recognized no God except necessity. A historical analysis of the power and politics in France of the old regime reveals how the beast crisis represented more than a regional emergency. He challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between sovereign power and the protection of subjects. When the crown proved unable to stop the provincial predator despite deploying resources that could wage European wars, questions arose about what legitimacy meant if it could not guarantee basic security. The escalation of royal involvement, traced from dismissive contempt to desperate engagement, revealed a growing recognition of the political consequences. The initial reports reaching Versailles were dismissed as provincial exaggeration, typical peasant hysteria that local authorities must deal with. But as the death toll mounted and the regional economy collapsed, the pressure grew for royal intervention. The deployment of Captain Duhamel's dragoons in February 1765 represented the first recognition that this exceeded the normal wolf problem. But their failure after months of intense hunting began the erosion of royal prestige that would accumulate throughout the crisis. Royal correspondence preserved in the National Archives shows Louis XV's growing personal investment in resolving a crisis that threatened to become a metaphor for greater governmental inadequacies. His letters to the regional quartermasters reveal frustration bordering on rage that a mere animal could stand up to the concentrated royal efforts. The appointment of François Antoine, the king's personal arquebusier and renowned wolf hunter, as a royal huntsman with extraordinary powers, demonstrated the commitment of resources that would normally be reserved for suppressing an uprising or fighting foreign enemies. The financial resources deployed against the beast have reached staggering proportions. The rewards offered for the death of the beast exceeded the annual income of prosperous merchants. Professional hunters imported from all over Europe commanded salaries comparable to military officers. Weapons specially created for hunting the beast consumed resources that could equip entire regiments. The total expenses, carefully hidden in royal accounts to avoid embarrassment, probably exceeded the cost of minor military campaigns. And all this wealth turned out to be impotent against a creature that operated according to the economics of survival, not finance. Military failures proved to be particularly damaging to royal prestige. The dragoons, elite soldiers who faced human enemies on European battlefields, found themselves outmaneuvered by an animal that seemed to understand their tactics better than they understood its nature. Organized raids that were supposed to catch any normal animal failed repeatedly. Ambushes on likely hunting spots did not catch anything, while attacks occurred in supposedly cleared areas. The military's inability to impose order through force has exposed the limitations of conventional power in the face of an unusual threat. François Antoine's success in killing a large wolf in September 1765, which the crown immediately declared a beast despite local skepticism, revealed a political necessity overcoming empirical reality. The elaborate ceremony of transporting the carcass to Versailles, the royal viewing where the courtiers proclaimed their relief, the official declaration that the crisis was over, all represented a representation of power rather than an actual resolution. As the attacks resumed over the weeks, the Crown was faced with a choice between admitting deception or maintaining fiction. They chose fiction, officially insisting that the beast is dead while quietly supporting continued hunting. The political consequences extended beyond the immediate crisis to broader issues of governance and protection. Enlightenment political theory justified absolutism through a social contract where subjects surrendered their freedom in exchange for protection. But if the crown could not protect the peasants from a single predator, what justified their surrender of freedom? Philosophers focused on abstract rights found in Zhevodan, a concrete example of government failure that supported their criticism more effectively than theoretical arguments. The regional nobility became trapped between the crown and the populace in ways that exposed fundamental tensions in the hierarchy of the old regime. Expected to maintain order in their possessions, they did not have the resources to address a threat that exceeded local capabilities. Appeals to Versailles brought interference that undermined their authority without providing effective assistance. The peasants blamed the nobles for failing to use traditional hunting rights to eliminate the beast, while the crown blamed the nobles for exaggerating the crisis to extract resources. The beast thus became a catalyst for exposing contradictions in feudal structures that would contribute to their eventual collapse. The international perception of French impotence turned out to be particularly galling for the monarchy, which prided itself on its European supremacy. Newspapers across Europe reported with barely concealed satisfaction how powerful France could not stop a single animal from terrorizing a province. British newspapers particularly rejoiced, contrasting French military claims with the inability to protect the peasants. The beast became an international embarrassment that undermined the diplomatic position more effectively than a military defeat could, suggesting fundamental incompetence rather than mere tactical failure. Allowing the killing of the beast by Jean Chastel in June 1767, after official statements that he was already dead, created political complications that required careful management. The crown could not accept that Chastel had succeeded where the royal efforts had failed, without acknowledging the previous deception. The solution involved minimal recognition of Chastel, while maintaining the fiction that François Antoine killed the real beast and Chastel merely eliminated a particularly large wolf. This transparent fiction did not deceive anyone, but allowed them to save face, which preserved the theoretical royal power while acknowledging the practical failure. The long-term political consequences extended far beyond the borders of Zhevodan. The crisis entered the collective memory as an example of royal inadequacy, which would be referenced during the revolutionary period as proof of the fundamental illegitimacy of the monarchy. Pamphlets asking if the king couldn't stop the beast, could he stop the deficit, clearly linked Zhevodan's failure to greater governmental incompetence. The beast thus became a symbol of the old regime's inability to address real problems while maintaining complex claims of authority. Zhevodan demonstrated that political power, no matter how absolute in theory, faces practical limitations when confronted by forces operating outside human systems of authority. Nature does not recognize sovereignty, does not recognize divine right, and does not respect human hierarchy. The crown's failure to protect its subjects from the beast anticipated major failures in addressing system challenges that would eventually engulf the monarchy itself. In this light, the beast becomes the prophet of the revolution, demonstrating through blood and horror that claims to absolute power become a mockery when tested against forces that do not care about human claims to power. Part 5. Divine Silence. The Theological Crisis in the Killing Fields. Zhevodan provoked a theological crisis that struck at the heart of France's Catholic understanding of divine providence, forcing them to face questions about God's justice that a convenient theodicy could not answer. Why would a benevolent deity allow such a sustained attack on believing peasants who attended Mass, paid tithes, and lived according to church teachings? A multiplication of religious explanations, each more sophisticated than the last, revealed deep anxieties about the meaning of suffering that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed theological certainties that held society together. Modern religious documents reveal the spiritual devastation that accompanied physical terror. A question of providence that no sermon could adequately answer when children were torn from their mother's arms by a being who seemed to mock both divine protection and human prayer. Parish priests have left harrowing accounts of attempts to comfort orphaned families while struggling with their own doubts, providing a window into the theological trauma that paralleled the physical devastation. Bishop Mann's pastoral letters, preserved in the diocese's archives, reveal an institutional church struggling to maintain a coherent theological response while addressing the pastoral needs of a terrorized population. His initial interpretation of the beast as divine punishment for collective sin required an explanation of why the punishment took such a specific form and why it targeted those least capable of the sins he listed. When pressed to identify particular transgressions that deserved such an answer, he retreated to vague generalizations about declining morality that satisfied no one in the face of immediate terror. The local clergy faced more acute challenges as they served communities where faith provided the only available solace, yet seemed powerless against the threat. Parish records show a dramatic increase in confessions, special masses, and religious processions during the years of the beast, but also disturbing notes of parishioners questioning fundamental doctrines. If prayer could not protect innocent children, what power did it have? If the mysteries couldn't ward off the beast, what effectiveness did they have? If God allowed such evil, was he truly benevolent, omnipotent, or attentive to human suffering? The proliferation of popular religious responses has revealed how official theology has failed to address the lived experience of divine absence. Amulets, supposedly blessed by distant saints, appeared throughout the region. Pilgrimages to the shrines are multiplied with desperate families traveling dangerous roads in the hope that specific saints can provide protection that a common providence has denied. The heterodox practices that the Church had suppressed for generations were re-emerged as people searched for any spiritual technology that could work where Orthodox religion had failed. The Jesuit response proved to be particularly influential in shaping theological interpretation. Better educated in casuistry than parish priests, they developed complex arguments about permissive will versus active will, great benefits arising from visible evils, and mysterious ways that transcended human understanding. But their intellectual sophistication often sounded hollow to peasants burying mutilated children. One Jesuit suggestion that the beast could produce future saints through martyrdom provoked near revolt from grieving families who preferred living children to potential sainthood. The question of why children suffered disproportionately created particular theological difficulties. Traditional explanations about inheriting sin or serving by examples could not address the visceral reality of innocent deaths. Some theologians have suggested that the suffering of children can turn sinful adults. But this instrumental use of innocent pain raised disturbing questions about divine morality. Others suggested that early death saved children from future sins, but this logic could justify any atrocity as a hidden mercy. Exorcism attempts reveal the desperation of religious responses. Despite the lack of clear evidence for demonic involvement, several exorcisms have been performed at sites associated with the attacks of the beast. The failure of these rituals raised uncomfortable questions. Either the beast was not demonic, defying those who insisted it should be supernatural, or the exorcism was ineffective, defying church authority. Some priests have suggested that the beast may be a divine instrument that exorcism cannot expel. But this raised further questions about trying to resist God's will. The ultimate theological challenge came from the apparent aimlessness of the beast. Traditional theodicy could accommodate suffering that served clear purposes, punishment that corrected, tests that strengthened faith, martyrdom that inspired. But the beast killed without a pattern that suggested meaning. His sacrifices were not notably sinful or holy. Their deaths did not produce clear spiritual benefits. Suffering seemed genuinely gratuitous in ways that theological frameworks struggled to accommodate without acknowledging either divine cruelty or absence. The long-term theological impact extended beyond the immediate crisis. The generation that grew up during the years of the beast showed marked decline in religious practice, suggesting that childhood experiences of divine silence left permanent spiritual scars. Seminaries have reported difficulties recruiting from affected regions. Parish records show decreased participation in voluntary religious activities, even as compulsory observances continued. The beast has killed faith as surely as bodies, leaving a spiritual vacuum that Enlightenment rationalism will partially fill. Zhevodan thus stands as a historical moment when traditional theodicy was confronted with an empirical evil that it could not adequately explain. The theological creativity deployed to rationalize the murders, from sophisticated Jesuit casuistry to crude folk superstition, revealed a religion struggling to maintain coherence when its promises of divine protection proved empty. Every parent who prayed for their child's safety and received a mutilated corpse experienced a crisis of faith that no doctrine could fully resolve. In their agonizing questions about divine justice, we hear echoes of every generation that faces inexplicable suffering and finds traditional religious answers insufficient solace for inconsolable grief.